Library. I'm Renee Urcity. I've been working here since the beginning of July as, I guess my official title is Adult Services Librarian, which sounds a little risque if you ask me, but that's what they call me. Thank you all for coming. I have invited Forrest Hammond from Vermont Fisheries and Wildlife to talk to us about black bears specifically, though I think he's a pretty smart guy, and if you have other questions, I bet you he'll help. He told me before you all got here that he's been working with bears in some form for 4 decades. Wow. So I think Forrest is the man to answer our questions. My hope in presenting this program was to create a little empathy for the bears, that we all have to share the world, and I would really hate to have to euthanize the ones that are living near to us. And we've had a lot of wonderful programs by Mr. Whitlock back there telling us about how we can keep them out of our yards, and that's been great information. And this, I thought, if we could take it a step further to learn about the bears themselves and their lives and how they operate, that might help us understand why we don't have our bird feeders out and things like that. So that's enough of me. Thank you, Forrest, for coming all the way here, and
sure.
Here we go.
Thank you, Renee. I'm a wildlife biologist for the state of Vermont. I've worked for 26 years, I think, for the state of Vermont. Prior to that, I was a wildlife biologist for the state of Wyoming. And one way or another, I didn't set out for that to be the way it was, but I have worked with bears a good part of that time, either with research or management or both. So I feel lucky to be back in Vermont, where I grew up in Vermont, and just in getting a job in wildlife is always difficult. To just be able to come back to your home state, it's a wonderful thing. Last year, working with bears in the state, it was a difficult year. It was a busy year. It was difficult for bears and other species because it was not a nut or a berry or a food year for a lot of the species. And it was tough for the bears to find any food at all, and with that, bears that are normally pretty wary of people overcame that wariness and started coming into people's backyards at a much higher rate than we'd ever seen before. We had 2 bears in the state that became celebrity bears, and one of them was the Hanover bear that was relocated from Hanover, New Hampshire to the northern part of New Hampshire, and it crossed over into Vermont and spent most of the year going up and down the state trying to find its way back to Hanover, which it finally did just this spring. It actually denned in Vermont. It covered more ground than we could have believed any bear could have. And we went to the den to switch out the collar. It was in Pomfret, Vermont that the bear denned up, and we thought it must be skin and bones. It never stopped to eat. It would hide up during the day in thickets and then walk anywhere from 10 to 25 miles each night. And we just couldn't see how it was getting any food, but actually when we visited the den, it was in actually pretty good shape. I don't know how it was able to do that. So that was an exciting bear, and it got a lot of news and press and stuff. And the other bear was the Middlebury bear here, which we recognize now as something that's very exciting that happened. Our message partly is that we feel people should be able to tolerate bears better than they do, and you can learn to live with bears. Even though bears can be very damaging, they could even be dangerous in some situations, but if you learn about bears, then they're not very much, and you can learn to live with them, you can tolerate them a lot better. In Middlebury last year, we kind of reached a new example of how that could be done. Dale Whitlock, your local game warden, is here. He was a key person for doing that as well. And we'll have some time afterwards maybe to give an update on that particular bear and stuff there. There had never been in the state such a movement of the public to try to work to get the message out and everything that you can live with bears, and if you just take care of your garbage better, take down your bird feeders, and tolerate a bear that's living in town with their cubs. And that was a pretty amazing thing that happened. Usually when we have bears that get well known like that, it doesn't end well for the animal. as well as for moose or anything else. And so that was a pretty good story that all reached. And it may not be over yet. But tonight, Renee asked me to give a presentation about bears in general and about some of the challenges here in Vermont and what we're working with. So I'm going to run through that. I've got a presentation that'll take 45 minutes or 50 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and stuff, and maybe discuss the Middlebury bear a little bit further.
Next.
Sure. 20, 30 years ago, bears were a lot less common in the state, especially with being seen by humans. The bears, for the most part, lived in the mountains, the Green Mountain chain through the center of the state and the Northeast Kingdom. And mostly it was people that lived there or that visited the mountains hiking and hunting that would actually see bears. And not many other people saw bears. But now the most common way that people see bears in Vermont is actually out their kitchen window or living room window. And the bears are coming to us now. And it's not that we have a huge number of bears, and the increase in bears has been what it has done it on its own. It's the fact that the bears moved out of the mountains, their distribution changed to where they're now trying to live in the towns where we live. And so they're living out in the backwoods. They're very much tempted if there's something in our backyard that smells good. So there's a lot more chances to have interactions with people. And the challenges certainly that we have with that. Yeah. All right. It has to slam it, I guess. There we go. So black bears across North America occur, the largest number occur in Canada, but we have a great many as well in the lower 48 states. There are over 500,000 bears in North America. They're very common. They're certainly not endangered, but at the same time, they're a species that does have an incredible amount of challenges. The number of bears that we have, it varies state by state, jurisdiction. We have roughly the same number of bears as New Hampshire does, somewhere usually between 4,000 and 7,000, and it fluctuates. Some of it's annual mortality as well. Some of it depends on management. In the lower 48 in New England, Maine, of course, has the largest number of bears. And they've got a lot of challenges in Maine with the bear population in that they depend on hunters to actually control the number of bears, and they just don't have enough hunters to do that, and their population's been expanding. And so they're facing some increasing challenges that we don't even have yet. The population of bears in the state is not stable. It does fluctuate quite a bit. We have some control over it, but then years like last year can influence the population a great deal as well. We think an awful lot of juvenile bears actually died last year from the lack of food. And there's no way that we can really count that. With black bears, which are forest-dwelling animals, it's almost impossible to count bears. We rely most heavily on actually harvest data, where we ask hunters to give a tooth from each bear, and so the sex and tooth information allow us to develop a population model, a life table on the bears, based on how many bears would have to be out there living to produce that many bears of different age classes that are being harvested. But it's a rough estimate. We use 5 years of data for every estimate that we do. At one time, around 2010, we were above our population objective. At that time, the population objective was 6,000. We got up over 7,000 bears. And so we simply extended the hunting season by 4 days and made that difference. The bear that we have in Vermont is the eastern black bear. Its physical characteristics are that it's jet black in color. It also has some brown on its muzzle. You can see the cubs have brown ear tips as well. And about a third of the bears have a white crescent on their chest as well. The bears in Vermont are smaller than many of the other states that surround us. I think it's just a difficult time for a bear to make a living in Vermont. We don't have consistent food sources like they do in other places. In particular, we're losing our young forests where the berries are produced, the early successional areas. We don't have many species of nut-producing trees as well. And we'll talk more about food and stuff, but the result of the fact that we don't have a consistent food source is our bears are fairly small. They're dependent on the forest. They've evolved using trees for security, where the other bear species in North America, the polar bear and grizzly bear, were both bears of an open environment where they were masters of that environment. If they were startled, they're more apt to charge whatever it was, and so they can be quite dangerous. Black bears much less so. A black bear that is startled usually will look for a tree to climb as fast as it can. And the cubs learn to climb at a very early age. We have not always had a lot of bears. The bears were quite common, and early Americans used the bears especially for the pelt and for the meat. The fat was very valuable because that was difficult to come by for Native Americans and even the early settlers that we had. But what really hurt the population was once Vermont was cleared for farming and for the sheep industry. There just wasn't the trees and the habitat for bears, and for a while we had very few bears, and they were just up in the very mountaintops. There was a time when Vermonters, probably generations of Vermonters, didn't get to see a black bear in Vermont growing up and stuff, especially in the 1800s, the early 1900s, there were just very few bears. The Native Americans used bears, as I say, for meat and pelts, but of course it was dangerous to hunt bears. Probably the early Americans were most effective at hunting bears when they were denned up in the wintertime. I'm sure that it was a big source of meat, and it was celebrated when they could find the den of a bear. And once a den was found, they went and got other folks to come, and they would surround that den, and they could actually kill a bear by doing it. So probably during the wintertime, they're most vulnerable in their dens. Because bears like to eat a lot of the same foods we do, they were in direct conflict with the early European settlers as well. Their crops that they had, their livestock that they had, the bears liked to eat those. And so even though hard cash was hard to come by, they did establish a bounty, which for a lot of years they paid out on black bears as well as other predators. And it wasn't until the early 1940s actually that they did away with that bounty, and the bear population began to rebound some. Today, hunting does occur in the state. We have a culture of hunting in Vermont, as you know, but even with that, only a small portion of the hunters in the state, the hunters that hunt for deer, hunt for bear, or say that they would even shoot a bear. Somewhere between 15 and 20% of the hunters say they might do that. It tends to be a cultural thing handed down in families, where a family likes to hunt bears and they like bear meat a lot. And we've surveyed our hunters to see how many bear hunters we actually have in the state, and we find we still have enough that with different hunting strategies, with changing the length of the hunting season, we still can adjust the population of bears. Bears are one species that we don't manage for what the biological carrying capacity of the land is, and we can maybe have that many, like we tried to do with deer and with moose. With bears, it's how many will people actually tolerate? And so when we put a management plan together, we go out to the public and say, how many bears would you like to see? And we know that people don't know how many bears there are, but from your perception and what you see around you in your neighborhoods, would you like the same number of bears or more or fewer? We go out to the public every 10 years with that. One controversial type of hunting that is allowed in the state is hunting with hounds. It's one of the most closely regulated types of hunting that occurs. There's more regulations concerning hunting with hounds than there is hunting for deer. And we have in the state somewhere less than 100 people that have permits to hunt with hounds. We're not sure exactly how many packs of hounds those is, because often there are multiple family members that get permits with the same one. And houndsmen count for about 15% of the annual harvest each year. But more importantly than that for us as managers is a lot of the houndsmen will volunteer to work with their local game wardens as well if there's conflicts, especially with farmers are having with bears and things like that, to chase them from different areas. But it's still controversial, and you'll at times, I'm sure, see things in the paper and stuff about hunting with hounds. I am kind of biased for the use of hounds myself, because once I returned from Wyoming here and I was doing bear research in the state, the way we would capture bears is actually to run them with hounds. And once they went up a tree, the hounds were drawn off, and we'd put up a net and dart the bat bear. We could put collars on and study it. So it helps supply the study animals, and I've developed quite an appreciation for what it takes to train these dogs and work with it. We're a small state, and certainly the Hanover bear showed us that one bear can walk the whole length of the state, pretty much. And so we do not relocate bears. Their home range is large. Male bears don't really even have a home range. They'll travel for hundreds of miles in the course of a year, looking for females and looking for good concentrated food sources as well. The females, though, actually do have a home range, but it varies in size depending on their age and whether or not they have cubs of the year or cubs, second-year cubs with them or not. When they first come out of the den with little tiny cubs, a female for a couple months might not go more than 100 or a couple hundred acres just around where the den was and stuff like that. A very small area. So if you're seeing a female with little cubs, chances are they live very close to where you live and stuff as well. What makes bears interesting and very much a challenge is the fact that more than most animals even, bears really rely on finding enough food to exist and to reproduce and for their young to survive. And they have to do that in just a fraction of the year's time, because they're denning for up to 5 months of the year where they're not eating or drinking. And so they're frantic at times to find that much food. If a female can't find enough food, then either she can't produce young or her young will die. So there's a lot of incentive for bears to find concentrated food sources that are very nutritious. And so what do they have for natural foods out there? Starting in the springtime, bears will eat buds, they'll eat sedges, some of the succulent grasses growing. As the spring develops, dandelions are good. Through the spring and summer, jack and the pulpit are very important for bears. The corn is like a nut, and bears are able to eat that. Jewelweed is important right up through the fall. Catkins in the spring are important. But all those things, all the vegetation that the bears are eating, they're just existing. They're not herbivores. They're classified as a carnivore and an omnivore. But their system is not that of an herbivore. They can't digest the vegetation any better than we can. So they're not getting fat on vegetation. It's not till the berries and nuts first come out that they start providing the sugars and the nutrients that they can possibly start putting on weight that they so badly need. And unfortunately in Vermont, we don't have many species that have that kind of sugar and carbohydrates for the bears to eat. And the ones that we do tend to fluctuate year to year on their availability. We get late frosts and stuff, and in a particular year we won't have any berries or any nuts or something like that, kind of like last year. So it's not until those first berries are starting to be produced, usually in late July with raspberries and blueberries being some of the first, followed later by chokecherries, that the bears actually finally start putting on weight. When they find these foods, then they can put on a lot of weight. They go through something called hyperphagia, where they might even feed for 24 hours at a time, gorging themselves. They can put on 1 pound, 2 pounds a day feeding once they've got into this. But most of our berry species you just can't find in that concentrated in large amounts. Blueberries usually are pretty small in the wild ones. Raspberries usually are pretty widely distributed. Blackberries on a given year, they can get a mouthful at a time, but it's often kind of difficult. In most years, they're not that good. And so it's a difficult time for the bears, and the whole time they're smelling other foods coming from people's backyards. And bears have a sense of smell that's incredible. It's been said that they have a sense of smell that's at least 12 times as good as a bloodhound's. And a good food source they can smell from 1 mile to 2 miles away. So some years the bears have trouble finding something concentrated enough they can actually start putting on weight with. For bears, it's all about quality, quantity, and risk with where their food is. So they're looking for a high quality of food, something they could put fat on, and that occurs in a quantity that's concentrated. They can stay right there and get fat. But we know they're smart enough to evaluate things for risk as well. They don't like trying to get foods around people. They know that we're dangerous for the most part. They have an innate wariness of people that some bears can overcome it, but usually it's to their detriment. What we found is actually beechnuts. In a year that there's a good supply of beechnuts, and it actually bears can put on the most weight on wild foods, even though it's a little tiny nut. They actually can. So what it ends up coming down to is, of all the things that a bear might eat in the state, there's just a handful of things that are the most important to them. Apples, blackberries, acorns, and beechnuts are something the bears always like. They'll check those out if they occur in large amounts. They'll feed on them a lot, but some years they just don't occur. What we found, because we actually go in and count nuts, sample nuts and berries in different places around the state, is we found a good food year happens roughly every other year. So it's not even consistent for the bears. And that's probably one reason their bears are smaller. They just never get a chance to attain those larger sizes because of the food. One food that is consistent is actually farmer's corn. And it actually occurs, it's very concentrated, it's very nutritious. Bears can put on a lot of weight very quickly, and they do. In fact, years where the other foods don't occur very much and the bears move into the corn, some of their largest bears are harvested, and their harvest is years when they go into the corn. But the interesting thing is, even though it's the most concentrated type of food they could possibly find, when any other foods are out there they can be feeding on that occur much, they don't go into the corn much. So they actually evaluate it for its risk. And the risk is that no farmer wants his corn flattened by bears, and he'll try to get hunters in there and they'll try to kill them. Somehow the bears know that, and so that if the other foods are there, they prefer to feed on those, even though they don't end up attaining as big a weights as they do in the years that some of them go into corn. There is one food that's lacking in the state that might make a difference with the number of cubs that produce, the age that females first produce young, and the weights that bears can attain. And that's this plant here. Who recognizes what this plant here is?
Skunk cabbage?
Skunk cabbage, absolutely. Skunk cabbage, anything you read about bear foods, it talks about skunk cabbage. First thing in the spring, that's what the bears go to and feed on that. So when I first came back to Vermont and started bear research, I went into the swamps looking for skunk cabbage. And these were areas of high elevations, and lo and behold, I couldn't find any skunk cabbage anywhere at all. It does occur in some of the low elevation towns. Actually, this area, the southern Champlain region, has skunk cabbage in some areas, but it's not areas that the bears normally or historically use. They are moving into some of these areas now. But in the mountains, the areas that we had historically had populations of bears, we just don't have skunk cabbage. And so the bears instead are forced to feed on sedges, buds, and grasses early in the spring instead of the succulent plant. Down in Massachusetts and in Connecticut, parts of Maine where they have a lot of skunk cabbage, the bears go, and they can actually attain higher weights and put on weight first thing in spring to eat skunk cabbage. I've really been bummed that we don't have more in the state. I've tried to transplant it in different places unsuccessfully. It must have something to do with our soils and stuff like that as well. If you go down in Connecticut, I'm sure you all have friends and relatives in Connecticut, every wetland is full of skunk cabbage, and they consider it a weed. And when you look at the bear studies that are done in those states, in the spring, even if they're overwintering beech nuts, the bears are in the wetlands eating those skunk cabbage. So, like I say, it's a plant we don't have in the state. So instead, the month of April and May in Vermont is a time of walking starvation for our bears. Any of you that have walked in the woods at those times know that we have a delayed green-up that may last for a couple months in the springtime. The poor bears come out of starvation, out of hibernation. They have not eaten for 5 months. And what do they find? There's very little out there they can eat. So it's little wonder that they are attracted to backyards if someone still has their black oil sunflower seeds still hanging in the backyard. And a bear smells that, they're starving, and it's easy for them to be attracted and come into our backyards. Even though they know we're trouble, they do not want to be around us, but they try to overcome that. Bears are predators. They've got great big canines. They can kill things, but they're not very efficient predators. Black bear are not as well. Grizzly bears and polar bears, that's different. They eat a lot more meat than black bears do. But one thing that black bears do have is a really good sense of smell. And early in the spring, when the deer are dropping their fawns, they do seek out fawns. And so for a period of about 3 weeks, black bear do seek out and get all the fawns they can. They are eating meat at that time. If you find bear scat in the woods in early June, and you pick it apart with a stick or something, you'll often find little tiny black hooves in it. So they are, does this affect the deer population? Deer evolves with lots of predators. Bears do not control our deer population at all. Sure, they certainly take fawns when they can, but they're not a controlling factor on the deer. I think our deer biologist almost wishes they would in some areas. The bears are just so darn smart. There's always talk about how you can keep your food just simply by hanging your food up and keep it away from bears. But bears learn how to find food different ways. You try to keep it away from them. They're just so smart. They are smart. But what I tell people is, you're smarter. I've got a friend who's a game warden, though, who responds to a great deal of calls of problems with bears. And he says, you know what, it's kind of interesting where people don't use their brain when they first see a bear or they're having a problem in their backyard. He says, for some reason, they're bear dumb. He said, I consider people using bear dumb. And so we do remind them that you can figure out how to live with bears, how to control the bears coming into your neighborhood, what you can do with it. There's certainly some tricks with it, but we are smarter than the bears are, and that's what gives us hope with that. I mentioned earlier beech being important to the bears, and because of that, we actually try to protect habitat for the bears that the bears use a lot to find those beech nuts in the years that are there. What makes it easier for us is the bark on beech trees is soft, and the claw marks remain after bears climb that tree, so we find an area with a lot of climbing going on. It has a lot of fidelity for bears using, and we actually try to protect that. And it's interesting how bears feed on beech nuts. The nut is actually at the top. It tastes a lot like a chestnut. It's very sweet if you haven't eaten them before. They're very good, but very small. To maximize the efficiency of feeding on this, to actually gain weight from it, bears will actually lick them up or pull the branches even up the tree before they fall. and it's that hard shell phase in the middle there. They'll just crunch up and eat shell and all. Their digestive system, they have adapted to be able to eat these shells. And then they just process it and poop out the shells later, and they just keep eating them. You'd think it'd be pretty rough on the bear, but that's how they gain weight, and they're doing well. They end up having more cubs in those years after there are beechnuts in the woods and stuff. And the one thing that makes beechnuts available to bears as well is they actually fall fairly late in the season, get covered up with snow, and then in the springtime, during that April and May period, they start germinating, but they can still be fed on by the bears, and the bears can actually gain weight in the spring times after we've had a good beechnut year the previous year. And one fascinating thing is the way they feed on beechnuts in years that there aren't many berries and stuff. They'll actually get a jump on feeding on beechnuts by climbing the trees and breaking the branches, folding them into a fork in the tree and feeding. It looks like a great big squirrel nest up in the tree that's 10 feet across. We call them bear baskets or bear nests. And again, it helps us identify those areas that are used a lot by bears. And how much food that a female bear gets determines when she'll first have her cubs, at what age, how many cubs she'll have, and whether or not they'll survive. Bears physically can have cubs if they receive unlimited amounts of food, if they're fed and everything. By age 2, they can even produce cubs. And the litter sizes can be up to 5 or 6 in areas there are limited amounts of food. In Vermont, that's not the case. Probably the average age of first producing young cubs for a bear in Vermont is probably age 4 in Vermont. And the first time a female has cubs, usually she just has 1 cub, and often it doesn't survive. She's just not experienced enough, she's very small. She has trouble finding enough food, she can't lactate enough, and usually dies. And she ends up having cubs again the next year when she's bigger and more experienced, and they have a better chance of making it. But to see 3 cubs means that a female is usually older, more experienced, and bigger, and has a bigger home range than other females do. Bears, as I said, they've evolved to climb trees. That's how they flee. Cubs, even when they're in the den, when we're working a female, we place a den on a small cub on a tree, they can actually have such sharp claws they can actually start climbing. And when the mother first brings them out of the den in the springtime, she teaches them to go up a tree when she tells them to, and come down when she wants them to as well. Yes.
How long is the gestation period?
That's interesting. The bears actually breed usually in July, but it's actually a delayed implantation where the egg doesn't actually start to develop until usually September or October, and then it's usually in January that she'll produce cubs.
So while she's denning?
While she's denning, and when she first has them, they're hairless and about the size of a squirrel. They're blind and hairless. So she's pretty helpless in the den, and the cubs are as well. If she leaves them at all, they would just die from the cold. And so for a period of a couple months, she keeps them against her stomach, and she curls up around them. And if she's disturbed in the den or whatever, she'll just lay there and usually put up with it, because she knows if she runs off or leaves the cubs, they'll just die at that time. While a male bear, if something like the snow machine or something disturbs a bear, or has a den in the ski area and the ski season starts, a male bear will just get up and go find a different den site. But the females that have cubs are helpless, and they have to stay there. So as a manager, managing bears, I've taken years of college courses and stuff on managing wildlife. What we found is managing a particular species is not difficult. What's difficult is actually the interactions with people and getting people to work with you with that species. And there's none probably more difficult to do that with bears. The average person is actually scared of bears to begin with. And that makes it difficult as well to think rationally about what you should do with best. Vermont is known for protecting a lot of black bear habitat. And for years, that was the major emphasis on our bear management program, was to make sure we had enough good habitat in the state. And that we worked with developers and stuff to tweak their projects to make sure that the bears could live in an area. But over time, the emphasis on habitat protection, although we still do it, the bear-human conflicts have become so common now that that's the emphasis of our management program in the state. And when I go to meetings around North America, I find that most other jurisdictions are the same way as well. 20 and 30 years ago, we were worried about losing black bear populations in different states. But they've all expanded now, and the populations have grown, and instead it's like, how can we get people to live more with bears than what they do? We have, in Vermont, we're lucky to have regulatory review laws like Act 250 and Section 248 that actually require us to comment on big projects about what the impact, especially commercial projects, would have on wildlife. And with bears, we've actually been able to work as first starting with ski areas, then with wind developers and large subdivisions at high elevations. We've been able to protect a lot of habitat for bears. And we continue to do that. The ski areas especially, they've got templates for years. They've known that they need to work with us on doing that. The wind development and others, it's been a little bit of time of transition, working with them. The first research that I did in Vermont was in the early 1990s with the Stratton ski area. Some Japanese corporation had bought the mountain resort, and instead of trying to concentrate on skiing and building infrastructure around the base of the mountain, they were looking at making it a four-season resort and really building up a lot of condos and stuff all around the mountain. And so that was a challenge for us, and we actually did a study working with them to develop a template on how you could have build out on a mountain resort but still protect wildlife and especially bears. And the other ski resorts took that up afterwards and worked with that. So the challenges with bears that our public faces in trying to live with bears, probably any beekeeper in the state knows that bears are an issue if they're trying to raise bees. And so they're the first group that were having conflicts with bears at first. Developed ways, especially using electric fencing, where they actually can, for the most part, raise their bees around bears if they're using electric fencing correctly. The challenge is to get now people with backyard chickens and stuff to do the same thing. And I mentioned earlier about corn being important to bears, and it really is in those years that it's not there, but the farmers don't want to feed those at all. We've got one farmer in the town of Bridgewater. He's probably the only farmer who raises corn. He's got a small dairy farm, and he told me last year that he lost $25,000 worth of corn, so he had to buy corn because of all the damage that he had with the bears. He said if that happens again, he'll go out of business. So it can be a real issue. We're trying to work with that farmer and try to show him that there's other things you can do other than just try to shoot the bears. And we've actually got a test case. We put electric fencing around one of the fields. I stopped and checked it on the way here. The bears still haven't got into that field. And we've got cameras up to show them walking around the outside and stuff like that, but they haven't got in. So we know that can work. There are ways of using noisemakers and stuff like that. But we're going to try to work with this farmer and others so that they don't just have to kill the bears. They don't perhaps lose as much corn as if they have in the past. But it's still something we work on, and it's very real. The bears, once they enter a cornfield, they've got all the cover if they need in there. Their hiding cover is there. They've got all the food they need. They only leave to find water. And what they do is they'll go into the center of the field and they'll just start trampling it down and eating the ears of corn. But by trampling it down, and it makes it very difficult for the farmer if that corn is no good to chop anymore. He's just lost that section of the field. And So it is a real problem. For years, we've recommended farmers use houndsmen to keep checking it, to scare the bears out so they don't get a chance to eat it very much. But with the parcels of land getting smaller and smaller, often the adjoining land is owned by other people who just don't want dogs chasing bears and stuff. And so that's not an option for many of the farmers anymore. Bears really like our garbage. We throw so much food out there that they do very well on garbage. They don't usually first come into backyards looking for garbage. I really think it's bird feeders that attract them there for the most part to begin with. But once they're there, they start looking for other things. And as you can see, putting your garbage out on the curb in an open garbage can, it does not represent much of a challenge to the bear to go through that. And so we're trying to work with people, show them different ways to secure their garbage better. Just the simple act of waiting till the morning to put your garbage out there makes a big difference on whether or not the bears will hit that. Believe it or not, we've seen lots of cases in Vermont and a lot of national parks where they say individual bears will learn what the garbage pickup day is. And that's when they'll come around the neighborhood and stuff. They actually learn that. One thing that's been an additional challenge for trying to work with garbage is the garbage pickup companies. Years ago, they had metal covered tops to it. And it's been cheaper and easier for them to work with plastic, but the bears don't find the plastic much of a challenge either. And so where there are problems, we try to get the waste companies to supply metal lidded dumpsters that can be chained down and things like that, locked down so the bears aren't an issue. In a lot of the high mountain resorts, the bigger companies have been able to get the companies to provide those, but it's tougher for an individual who's got a dumpster to get the company to give them a bear-proof dumpster. That can be weird. But you can convert these using something with nails sticking out through a board that you put on top and things like that. It'll keep the bear off the top of your dumpster and everything. So there are different things using your head. We have a website where we have recommendations for doing all those kind of things. But even when you do have a metal dumpster, if the people aren't willing to open the door up and put their garbage in, then it just doesn't work. And so we try to work with the large residential areas that have signage out there to tell them why it's important to put your garbage inside and close the door and latch it, or else the bears just drag it off during the night and things like that. One of the newer things that have developed as a challenge or something of a problem with working with bears is composting now. I've never considered composting much of a bear issue, and it really wasn't. And when I talked with, say, my counterpart in New Hampshire, he says, yeah, once in a while they get compost, but it's not much of an issue for us. Well, in Vermont, as you know, the state of Vermont's been pushing now that we not take organic material anymore to the landfill. And so your kitchen waste and stuff, you've got to find something to do with it. So they're pushing composting. It's not a law that you have to compost, but it's just that you cannot put all those organic waste in the landfill. There are other things you can do, but they're pushing composting. And my understanding, and I've gone to classes and stuff to do composting correctly, is that if you compost correctly, very few odors, it's not much available there for bears, it's not an issue. The problem is that the class that I went to took all afternoon for me to learn how to do it correctly, and I don't think the average Vermonter is going to go take a class and do all that. But they probably will try what they think is composting by putting garbage out in their backyard. And so we're real concerned that that's actually going to draw more bears and it's going to be bigger issues going on. So we're trying to work with the Department of Environmental Conservation on what types of things, what's the, what messaging should we use with the public and stuff about how you do your composting. If you're having a problem, what can you do? But I tell you, I lose sleep at night some, waiting for July to happen where it's supposed to be mandatory. that nobody can put their kitchen waste in their garbage anymore and stuff like that. That they're going to be doing a lot more than this. But we're working with DC. We're trying to get the message out. There are a lot of ways you can do it correctly. I just really encourage you to get on the internet and just look up composting in bears. We've got a lot of information about that. We've got some here. And some
Next week on the 16th, Addison Solid Waste is coming here to give a workshop on composting.
Oh, wonderful.
6 o'clock.
I actually did a talk in Lincoln a couple of weeks ago with the Addison County compost folks and stuff, and it went quite well. We had a really good turnout, and it worked pretty well. But I will tell you that a lot of the plastic commercial composters that they're selling and stuff now, a bear would have no trouble just ripping that apart if you're putting in. Some of the open bin can, if it's not done correctly, will attract raccoons and skunks and possums, and what we've even seen in some areas, an increase of the European rats and stuff as well. But again, there are different ways to do it appropriately. One thing we tell folks is that if you've got other attractants in your backyard, like bird feeders, that's going to attract the bears from a distance. So even if you're doing it almost right, composting, very little odors, if the bear's there in your backyard anyway, he's going to get into your compost and stuff and maybe destroy your composter with that. So you certainly want to make sure you don't have any bird feeders up. And if it is an issue with wildlife, and you know it's going to be, especially with bears, electric fencing works. You can get a little electric fence kit to go around your composter, your garbage. If you've got chickens, whatever you've got, you can do that. I got one this spring because I started beekeeping again. And I put my little composter out in the middle of it. Well, you can also put your garbage there, and it works. These cost $150 or so. There's probably cheaper ways of setting these up as well. One key is, though, with electric fencing with bears, is you need to bait the wire. A little bit of tin foil wrapped up with peanut butter or bacon grease or molasses is all it takes. So a bear or a raccoon or skunk will come up, instead of just testing the wire, touch its nose or its tongue to that tin foil. And that's enough to always repel them. It works very good. Intentional feeding of bears is something that we certainly recommend against. We feel that people put themselves most at risk to feed bears. We've had 2 people that we know of in the past 10 years in Vermont that were actually injured by bears. Both were people who were intentionally feeding bears. They'd been warned to stop. They were women that lived, elderly women that lived alone. They loved wildlife, and they just couldn't stop feeding, and both of them got injured by bears doing that. This is a couple old pictures I had from Minnesota where it's legal to feed bears. This guy that had this bear, he knew the bear, he'd come and feed it marshmallows every day. One day he ran out of marshmallows a little too soon, and the bear nearly took his arm off. Bears are not domestic animals, they're not pets. They have all the physical characteristics that if they wanted to kill people, they could do it very easily, but they don't. They want to avoid people, they really do. There are tens of thousands of interactions with bears across the country every year. Where bears are in people's backyards, or people are camping out and stuff around black bears. Very few injuries ever happen. The bears intentionally try to avoid touching people. They really do. But there are some key things you can do, especially when you're camping, when you're hiking and stuff, you should be aware of. One of the big things with people being injured by bears is they've looked at the statistics, and 3/4 of the people that have been injured by bears is a dog involved. Using the dog has really gotten the bear angry to begin with, usually by chasing its cubs or trying to chase it. The bear will turn around and defend itself, chase the dog back, the dog runs back to its owners, and it can be a real problem. So certainly hiking with your dogs can be just fine, but if you think there's a chance you'll encounter a bear, you should have it under restraint on a leash, or at least know with a voice command you can tell it to sit, and it will, and it won't chase off after a bear comes. season. Bears can kill people. It doesn't happen very often, but we have so many black bears in the state or in North America that it does happen. For some reason, Alaska has a lot more fatalities than anywhere else. British Columbia has a lot. And some of our national parks have had problems as well, where the bears just don't fear people, and they're used to seeing people as a source of food. Believe it or not, having a hunting season actually modifies the behavior of bears and keeps them more wary, and they're not all on our backyards and in our faces all the time and stuff like that. So hunting does play a role with that as well. We've had one fatality in the state from bears, and it was back in 1943, where a hunter actually wounded a bear and then set down his rifle and decided he was going to finish it off with his knife. How stupid. That's the only one we hope. We hope we don't have any more. So what we do is, and I'll show it here in a little bit, we've got a reporting system where we ask you if you've had an incident with a bear or a visit from a bear in your backyard, that you just get on the internet and fill out a quick report form. I get a copy of that instantly. If I think I'll do a risk assessment of every report I get. If I think it's a lot of damage going on, the local game warden can know it, I'll send it to the game warden right off. And if I think that something's going on that's really dangerous, that someone get hurt, we'll mobilize right off to address that incident. Often to destroy a bear if it's reached that point. When a bear starts causing problems, it's progressive. They lose their fear of people, and it gets worse and worse, and at some point they start breaking into houses, going for the source of food, and at that point the bear is destroyed. And that's why we ask people to report sightings of bears in your backyard and things like that, so we just know where these incidents are going on and whether or not there's a situation occurring in a town somewhere that we should know of, and make sure that nobody gets hurt. It's one of my biggest fears that someone would actually get seriously injured by a bear in Vermont. When I go to my meetings with other bear biologists, other states, where they have had fatalities, what they say is, because there are so many bears now and so many people living in bear range and so much mixing, it's not whether or not sooner or later someone's going to be killed by a bear, but it's just a matter of when. And as you know, New Jersey a number of years ago had someone killed by a bear, and it can happen. So that's why we do this risk assessment. All our game wardens are trained to identify what are risky situations as well. We've got protocols on how to deal with bears, and we certainly work with that. So we hope we'll never have that. But again, someone who intentionally feeds bears is actually causing a dangerous situation in your town when that person's doing that, because a bear will begin looking at a person as a source of food. They're providing them with food. They lose their fear of people. There's always, it attracts a lot of bears, a lot of new bears that aren't used to it, but they eat some food there, and then they go out to the neighborhood thinking they can get food at the neighbor's place, the next neighbor's place. And those people probably don't want bears on the back porch or trying to get in their house. And everyone who feeds bears ends up having to barricade their own house to keep the bears from coming in. You probably can't see it very well, but at the base of that house, he's put electric fencing around his house. His doors are barricaded and stuff like that because bears at night try to get into his house. And that's what was happening with these women that got injured as well. They were feeding bears, and bears were trying to break into the house to get the feed and stuff like that. So if you know of anyone intentionally feeding bears, we really encourage you to let your local game warden know that. You certainly can remain anonymous with that, but it's just a dangerous situation for everybody in town when somebody is doing that. When we've got a chronic bear problem and a lot of bear incidents happening in a town, we actually go looking for the source of what's causing it. Usually it's someone that's feeding bears or something like that. If you do a lot of traveling to national parks, a lot of hiking, camping, and things like that in bear country, the best defense you can have on bears is to understand them better. And there's a couple books out there that are quite good. We promote one, Living with Black Bears. It's on our website and stuff, and it just explains what to do in every situation. But actually, if I was going to go and narrate the grizzly bears as well, I'd actually read Stephen Herrero's books. He's got a couple different editions out where he talks about people visiting national parks, what they did right and what they did wrong, and what they should have done. And he actually uses statistics from people that have actually been mauled or killed by bears to come up with what you should have been doing. And it's pretty dramatic as well. What you do in a situation with a grizzly bear is completely different than with a black bear. Whether or not it comes into your camp, you meet it on the trail, and things like that. And being able to understand that. This has a terrible title, Bear Attacks, but it's actually about bear behavior. It's a super book. We look at black oil sunflower seeds, as I said, as a gateway drug. For bears going on to a life of crime, as I say, they become more brazen over time. They get an easy food source. In just 10 or 15 minutes at a bird feeder with black oil sunflower seed, a bear at different types of year can get more nutrition, more energy from that than feeding all day in the woods. So it's a huge draw to the bears. And if a bear with its first few times that it comes to your backyard doesn't get a negative experience out of it, they're just going to go on and start getting worse with that. And usually it's a small juvenile bears, when they first left their mother, that account for most of the visits to people's backyards. These bears, it's hard to judge the size of a bear, but most of the ones are less than 100 pounds that first come into backyards. They're very impressionable. They're very safe to work with, scaring away, as opposed to a larger bear. You can tell if it's a juvenile bear if it seems to be real lanky. It has long legs in relation to its body, long ears in relation to its skull. Seems like it has a long neck. The bigger bears appear round and stocky and short-legged, but a young bear like that is a juvenile bear. So bears do want to come into our backyards, and whether or not we have bears into the future and a sizable population, whether or not we see them, all depends on you folks, on how many bears you want to tolerate and whether or not you can learn to live with them. Right? The bears, we can manage, we can work with them, but if the people keep allowing them to get food, it makes it more difficult and we'll have lots more problems into the future. But I put a picture of a moose up here because people in Alaska, in the city of Anchorage, actually have moose wintering inside the city limits, and the people have learned to tolerate the moose. They know how close to come to them and not. And so I've got a lot of hope for that. And even in Vermont, I think the Northeast Kingdom represents an area where the people have been around bears for a long time, and they put up with bears a lot. We don't get many calls or problems with bears in the Northeast Kingdom. Again, it's more with the people that first showing up the first time they come into your backyard or into your neighborhood that the people seem to get upset. It's these young bears at first are the ones that show up. Here's a yearling bear this spring, showed up at Plymouth State Park. We're trying to follow up on what we kind of did in Middlebury last year. We leave the bear in place and try to get people to change their behavior. With this little bear here, rather than go and get it, move it anywhere or something like that, we worked with the rangers to get the information out that they've got a small bear that might be coming around. Make sure you take care of your coolers and stuff and not let them get it. And we also distribute some noisemakers in the park, especially for the rangers, and also some bear spray. So when the bear would show up, it would get a negative experience. And so partway through the spring, this little bear, he wasn't having much luck getting food in the park. He just stopped coming around. So it can work. We're very hopeful with that. With the reports that we get in every year, we develop a map of where the most concentrated, where the largest number of reports that we're getting from the public. And so we try to do more outreach and spend more resources in those towns that are having more issues with bears and work with that. Some of the towns are probably going to be chronic anyway, like Killington, a resort. It's people from out of state. It's very hard to get to educate those folks and get them doing the right things. But we're going to work with it. We've got different programs going on. Again, your local game warden is your contact person. If you have questions either on the website or your local game warden stuff can help you with that. This is one of those young, impressionable bears coming in on your porch. Ben Killam, the bear behavioralist and rehabilitator in Lyme, New Hampshire, actually says what you should do is open your door, look it right in the eye, and stamp and act like you're going toward it. A little bear like that is just out of there. You just told it it's not wanted. And you could even, in a loud tone of voice, actually say, get out of here, you're not wanted. And they learn from that type of thing. A small juvenile bear, it's very easy to work with that type of thing. If you're unsure and don't have much confidence in hiking a certain areas where you've seen bears before, going through berry patches or something like that, and you're really concerned, or if you're hiking out in an area, you know bears sometimes come into campgrounds, well, I'd recommend actually purchasing some bear spray. It comes in a holster. It takes some training. There's a lot of YouTube videos on how to use it correctly, but it can stop the charge of a grizzly bear or a polar bear. It would work with a moose. It would work with a domestic dog that might be attacking you. So it's a good thing to have. If you just hike a lot by yourself in the woods, the people I work with, the foresters and other biologists and stuff, have been getting them more to wear these just for a sense of security. We had one technician that was working by herself that was attacked by a dog as she was coming back to her truck. And I said, boy, bear spray would protect you with that type of thing. It's worthwhile getting it. Again, you have to know how to use it right, but again, there's directions for how to do that. And the first time you order it, you order a can of inert spray that doesn't have the pepper in it. It just has the coloration, and you learn how to use it and work with the wind, something like that. Boy, it just gives you the confidence. Anybody running a campground or anything certainly should have that. Here's a copy of our report form on the internet. I've got also forms here that can be filled out, kept by your phone. I keep by my phone as a secretary. And you just, if someone calls in, it's all the information you need to put on the website as well. Work with that. Bears also don't cross roads very well. They don't look both ways. They tend to get hit in the same areas. We try to map those out in the state because we find that other forested animals also probably have trouble crossing the roads as well, including moose and bobcat and fisher at those same types of areas. And then working to try to map linkage habitat and have some kind of plan for protecting those to make sure wildlife can move across the landscape is very important for bears as well. They don't move in straight lines, but they use riparian areas, strips of woods. And so what we've been doing is working with conservation commissions, different groups, to actually try to map out the areas where wildlife do cross roads and work with it. And this is an effort going on across the country as well. It's probably a lot of our future of habitat protection in the state's going to be trying to work with wildlife travel corridors, working with that. So bears will always represent a challenge in the state. We have enough public lands, protected habitat in the state, we're always going to have bears. But how many we have, again, it's going to be up to people on how many you want. How willing are you to put up with some problems, especially with young bears, and try to adapt to it, maybe change your behavior a little bit. When there are bigger issues going on, sometimes we do research projects. We've got one going on right now with a wind energy project down near our Massachusetts border. We've actually put satellite GPS collars on bears and follow them, which is amazing. We can actually find where a bear is at any particular time and plot it on a map and find home ranges, different bears traveling with different bears, what type of habitats are using. Here's one particular bear where the whole cluster is the main part of the study area. There wasn't a lot of food late summer. This particular bear went over to near Bennington, just south of Bennington, into cornfields. And that's where that bear went. We have a lot of them go down to Massachusetts for acorns and things like that. So we certainly learn a lot from that. I'd actually like to use, these collars are pretty expensive. I'd actually like to use them on a bear like the Middlebury bear so we could track where it's getting food, which people are allowing it to get food. We kind of used the Hanover bear while it was traveling that way. If it suddenly stopped somewhere, then the local game would go check it out to see if someone had their feeders up and they're letting the bear get it, things like that. Certainly learn a lot from it. We do have management plans for all the major game species in the state. We do with bear. We're looking at a new planning period we're looking at right now. We've sent out surveys and we have public meetings. We're in the middle of those now. You should hear more about them. For bear, again, we are not planning on a lot of changes for the bear management in the coming future, but there certainly are for deer and for moose. There's a lot certainly going on for moose as well, but you may hear more from that. So our goal in management is just to have a wild population of bears out there that's not dependent on people. And we think we can do that, but again, do Vermonters want to change their behavior a little bit? We'll learn a little bit more about bears so we can have this beautiful creature can exist in the same towns where we live and stuff. And again, hunters is our tool for any management of the population, to have fewer bears or more bears. And as I said, we're lucky we have a population of hunters, but hunters overall across the nation are declining in numbers. We expect in the next 10 years to only have half as many hunters as we've got right now. So it's going to be more and more of a challenge with that. We know there's always going to be bears, there's going to be conflicts. We may not have the hunters to actually control the population and keep it to where we want. So we know there's going to be more challenges in the future as well. One quick story as I finish up here. I gave a presentation about living with bears at a state park down in Jamaica, and they've been having some problems with bears, so I went down and I showed them how you tell if you've got what size a bear is that's coming into your campground at night. Like just go into the dumpster and look at the size of the prints, because they come in at night when the grass is wet and they step on gravel and put their prints up. If you got a little bear, you can tell. I told them they have a little bear causing a problem, and I said find a way to give that bear a scare when it comes in. So I received some photos just a few days after I gave the talk from a ranger who was all excited. This little bear showed up at a campsite. Apparently there was a pie inside on the picnic table. And so they told the ranger. The ranger looked around and goes, what can I do to give the bear a scare? He picked up a fire extinguisher and he just walked at the bear spraying it. So the noise was there, the bear could see it. The guy was saying, get out of here, bear. Scared that bear, that young, impressionable bear, and they didn't have any more problems with it after that. Oh. He was so proud, that ranger got right over it. I give a lot of talks to hunters, different sportsman groups as well. I said there's a lot you can do to benefit bears. One of the big things is to help promote wild apple trees. Wild apple trees occur throughout our forests, but they're dying off because their short trees are actually choked out for lack of sunlight, and they'll die unless the taller trees are moved around them. So it's an easy thing that people can do. Also, anything we can do to promote young forests, areas where berries can grow. It's one of the types of habitat that's disappearing the fastest in Vermont is these areas where berries first come up after trees have been removed and stuff. And actually power lines going through forests are some of the biggest areas where you can find berries now, and where bears and birds and other things can find those. So we work with the power line companies quite a bit. And I never give a presentation without talking about the benefits of planned logging on your property to have different types of wildlife habitat. You can have that early succession habitat where berries are growing and stuff. You can have very healthy trees that can really benefit. A lot of the kids in our public now think cutting of trees is all bad, just like hunting is bad. And so it's something that's sustainable, renewable, can be a good thing. Last thing is hope for the future. One thing I'm really excited about is the restoration of American chestnuts. They occurred in portions of the state, probably this area of the state as well at one time, and provided a lot of wildlife food. We talked about how unpredictable our nuts and berries are. With American chestnut, they actually flower a month or two later, so it's always after the frost, when we're frost-free and stuff. And so every year it produced a lot of nuts. They were killed off at a blight decades ago, but they've developed blight-resistant strains now. So it's something I'm not going to see in my lifetime, these back in the forest, but it's going to happen in bears and turkeys, and our wildlife are really going to benefit from that. It's a nut that just can be eaten. It doesn't have a hard shell, and but it's very plentiful.
That you could advise where you could buy these. I've tried chestnuts over the last 20 years, and I've yet to get one to get over 3 years old.
Yep. And the reason for that is the early ones that they were trying to develop blight resistant were only partially blight resistant. And those are the ones you could get really easily. Usually they tell you it probably won't reach maturity, but you certainly can have it and work with. There are newer strains now where they did experimental orchards. Now they're trying to produce nuts to get them out there and stuff. But working with a group, you can get these kind of trees and stuff to work with it.
Do you have a site or where?
The American Chestnut Foundation, just go online and they can tell you more on that. It's still pretty expensive to get the real blight resistant ones and stuff. But you can work with a group to get one to create a seed orchard or something like that. Yeah. Yes?
I was curious when you were talking about hunting bears with hounds, and obviously you said that was controversial, but in your case you said it was helpful because you could collar the bear by means of help of hounds. But I'm wondering, why is there such a long so-called training period for this, from June until September? That's like all summer long. It seems like a really long time.
Training for what?
Training hounds.
Oh,
Hunting.
it is. It's probably longer than they need. Yeah, I agree. The Middlebury bear. Dale, you want to give an update on her, whether or not she's been cited or what she was doing this summer?
First, I gotta tell you how lucky we are. That was such a good presentation. Thank you. Forrest is an amazing man. I've known him since I was a new game warden. I was hired in '96. He'd been on, what, 2 years at that point? 1 year?
Yeah, something like that.
And he's always been available to every warden and anybody that reaches out to him. I'm really blessed to have him, so thanks.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
The Middlebury bear, most everybody knows about it, was a sow with 3 cubs, and she kind of took residence in Bud Off Acres. And with the help of the community and the Humane Society and Forrest, we were able to just get the word out. You really got to work on keeping the food source away from her. Put your bird feeders away and your trash locked up. And she did move slowly. It took a little while, but she went, and I got reports of people seeing her in Cornwall and this summer in Waveridge. And as far as I know, she's still somewhere in Waveridge. Forrest said usually this time of year they've kicked the cubs loose.
Well, by now they are, sure. Usually by August or so, the cubs are kicked off. That they lose the previous.
How long do the cubs stay with the sow? Is it a year and a half? I thought
Yeah,
it was
about
18
17
months.
months.
Okay.
They do. So the neat thing about what happened in Middlebury last year, which you guys were all involved with, it's the first time in the state we had a community-wide effort to try to live with bears and to allow a bear that some people were scared of. Some were calling in that wanted to get rid of the bear. They had their composter broken into, or birdseed, maybe their garbage, and their neighbors were coming around and telling them, if you do the right things, it won't be a problem. That bear has little cubs that can live here, and it did. And it's the first community in the state. This is what the future hopefully will be, with living with bears in the state is we'll be doing more and more of that. Some of the other states have programs like that where Vermont's such a small state, we don't have a lot of money. It's tough for us to raise money to have a Bear Wise or a Bear Smart program like some do. The state of Florida has like 35 people that work with bears and with communities. So it's a lot of effort because it takes training law enforcement as well as the communities, getting the right type of dumpsters and garbage cans and electric fencing. But I've got real hope. I think you guys have started something this last year working with it. It'll be interesting. This is a good food year. We didn't have many issues like we did last year with bears, comparatively speaking. Chances are, because it's been going every other year, that next year we won't have as much food and you'll have a bear or two in town causing problems. It's how do we want to deal with it, right? And especially if it's a bear that doesn't jump to try to break into houses and stuff, but it's just doing these low-key problems like getting bird feeders and getting some garbage and compost. Those are the types of things, if we just clean them up, it won't be an issue. And how are we going to be ready for it next year, right? You know, your police department, I think, is bought into it. At first, they were sick of all the complaints if the female went up a tree with her cubs and the crowds around, they get sick of responding to that and stuff like that. But I got the impression that they're ready to work with it more as well.
Yeah, the PD was great.
And there's a lot of people around the state looking at Middlebury and the way that was handled. Especially some of the humane groups and stuff like that that participated, went door to door. They knew it was a success story, and hopefully we'll get more of that.
Well, part of that is due to you, Dale. Thank you so much for,
Oh yeah.
you did a lot of talks, I know, last year and tried to keep people informed and feeling safe and understanding that we could all survive it. So, thank you.
Yeah.
Was the sow, the bear in Putolf Acres, were any of those bears ever tagged, radio tagged? Never, so there was...
No. As I say, in a perfect world, it would have been nice to capture her. She would have been easy to capture and put on one of those expensive GPS collars. Heck, Dale could have looked on his laptop where she is all the time and stuff like that. And you all could have tracked it. If somebody was intentionally feeding her, and could have gone and taken care of that issue right off. That would be a good thing to do. I think the price of these collars is going to come lower very soon. And I think the technology would be easier to do. And that would be a neat thing to do for a community, is just to have one or two of these collars and to work with the biologist and warden actually to track some of the bears. Leave it right in place and find out where the difficult challenges are in town for a bear to live.
Another question, is there a correlation that's sort of known, understood, between beechnut, the amount of beechnut that exists or other food and bear-human conflicts, like on an annual basis? Is it sort of known that during years of poor food, natural food production, that the bears are more likely, or is it more just sort of the bears are opportunistic, and so if someone's leaving their trash out, they're going to go through, and if there's lots of acorns and beechnuts or
It's both to some extent. Certainly, there's more pressure on the bears to stop feeding on wild foods and go to human foods. In a year, there aren't many wild foods, and that's been documented really well across the country. The scientific papers, and each state deals with that. But some bears, especially if a cub had a mother where it kind of taught it to get food from that, then the next year, even if there's a lot of natural foods, it might just decide, you know, I like going to this backyard and getting birdseed. Why should I go wandering out in the woods and get it?
Make stones better than nuts.
Yeah, so there's something that's going to happen every year, especially with these bears. The bears are smart. They've got good long memories. I'm sure when a bear hibernates, if it's gotten birdseed and some highly nutritious food in someone's backyard, when it's up there drifting in and out of a deep sleep for 5 months, and it's hungry, what do you think it's thinking about? It's like, where did I get food this last year? Where am I going as soon as springtime I leave here? It's, I'm gonna go back to the house. And that's what we tell people. If a bear was successful in getting food from your backyard, you will have that bear or other bears soon visit as well. Even if you destroyed that bear and got rid of it, it's interesting with their type of communication what happens. Because if a bear gets fed sunflower seeds and corn in someone's backyard and leaves for part of the day or to go nap somewhere a half-mile away, it'll probably defecate, it'll leave a trail and defecate. Other bears come along and say, oh, they'll check that out and say, what have you been eating that smells so good? And it backtracks that bear. So even if that bear is dead, other bears still follow its trail back to the source of the food and stuff like that. And we've had that happen in the state. In Montpelier, there was a real high-profile case where a person was killing the bears. It wouldn't stop feeding birds, and the bears kept drawing more, and he kept killing the bears. And it ended up, it made national news, and there was legislation making it illegal to kill bears coming into bird feed that happened with that. That was the first law we had like that in Vermont.
Speaking of bird feeders, I'm sorry, I'm just jumping in front of everybody. When is it okay? Like, can I have a bird feeder out in the dead of winter? I haven't put one out since we identified the bears in 2018.
Right.
And I miss my birds.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, can I put it out in the wintertime or should I never put it out?
You know what, by a rule of thumb, we say usually by December 1st, you ought to be able to put out your bird feeders. Take them down April 1st, April 15th in that area. But, you know, the reality is, and I think it was 2010, 2011, we had a winter, we had very little snow. The bears were out all winter long. So, and they were visiting people's backyards. People were angry because we had put press releases saying it's okay to have your bird feeders out and stuff like that. So a bear will den up when it's got when it can't get food easily anymore. When we've got a snow layer of half a foot to a foot that stays on the ground, then the bears will den up. And that's the best time to start feeding the birds. And that's when the birds need it the most. You know, they can't get the ground seeds and stuff easy either. And that's when they need it. You might get a visit in the middle of winter if you get a warm spell. The male bears actually will sometimes get up and wander around if we've got a spell of good weather and stuff like that. So sometimes they'll even show up. So I tell people, I said, don't be angry if one shows up. We do tell you it's okay to feed during that time period, but if a bear shows up, you probably want to stop for a couple of weeks. Yes. Yes, Judith?
I was going to ask that same question, just
Oh,
like
great.
when was it okay?
Yeah, if
So-
we get a good snowstorm, it seems to be staying on the ground. Ooh, that's the time.
So when also, so I have chickens and I've always kept my chicken food in a can outside chicken food. And I did have a bear come
Sure.
last spring and dragged my can of chicken food to the woods and
Right.
gorge itself. And so I moved it, obviously, and 2 nights later went out at night and saw the bear in the woods, but it was very scared of me and didn't come anywhere near me, and it was dark enough, couldn't really see it very well. But like when you have, I didn't know about the reporting, when you see something, like, is it too late now to report something like that?
No.
Or does it still help you?
No, it still helps.
know?
It gives us an idea, you know, where there are issues going on.
I
And
mean, it really
the
wasn't
fight
an
they
issue,
have.
it was my own fault, and
Yeah.
I never had any issues before, so I didn't worry about it. Well, now I'm a little
Learning
more
curve.
careful, yeah.
Yeah.
But
But it sounds like
it's
you
not
were
the
able to
bear's
make
fault.
changes and you
Yeah,
don't
it
condition
wasn't,
them.
it wasn't the bear's fault, it was my fault, but I didn't know
Right.
there were bears close enough to worry about, so.
Right.
It sounds like even if it, quote, wasn't an issue for you, you made adjustments. I think it sounds like you still want to know, because
Yeah.
that's an interaction, that's a data point that you can track.
Right. And, you know, doing a report, it's interactive. We send you material. You know, if you're having issues with chickens, we'll send you the information we've got on chickens and stuff like that. And again, if it sounds like it's a chronic problem that needs to be looked at, you know, Dale will get a copy as well. But the bears getting just bird feeders, getting into some garbage, chances are we wouldn't bother the local game warden. With that, we just offer advice and tell them the same thing Dale would say. And right from my office, do that and stuff all over the
So do you actually have bears take chickens?
Yeah, it's real interesting. In the past 10 years, the issues with chickens have become bigger than with bees for bears. Most of the beekeepers now know electric fencing, and that's what they do. So we don't get many reports with bees anymore. But we get a lot from chickens, from people having backyard chickens, 6 to a dozen chickens that got a little coop. And what usually happens is the bears aren't used to feeding on birds, but they smell whatever you're feeding the chickens, cracked corn and different stuff like that. And they'll come to feed on that, but here's a plump chicken sitting right beside where they feed, and they'll learn to kill them. And once they do, then that bear will probably be enough of a chronic problem to end up getting destroyed. Because once it can find a source of meat, it's hooked. It really is, yeah.
So I have everything else but bears eat my chickens. So,
Everybody loves chicken.
so I don't electrify it, but I already have a fence that's buried a foot deep, that's covered, and so I've kind of eliminated other things. But do you think I should probably electrify it now that I know a bear has been around?
That works the best.
Okay.
Certainly with these types of net mesh electric fencing that'll keep the chickens in as well as keep predators out and stuff like that. If you've got a dumpster or garbage issue, even one strand of electric wire that's baited probably will take care of that issue with bear. As long as it baits so they touch their nose to it, it's out of there as soon as it gets the shock and stuff like
And
that.
keep coons out of the garden too.
Yeah, it works really good. It is kind of an expense. When I look at it, when I bought mine this spring, I've got it for life now. I've got that electric fencing, I've got a solar charger. It should last for years and years, and I can keep all the critters out with it. So for me, it was an investment I decided to do. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
You had said that a lot of cubs don't make it through a bad year. So when those cubs die, will you see the skulls around? Like, will the skulls make it a couple of years?
No.
Or they're gone in a year?
An interesting thing, bones don't last long in the woods in Vermont. It's so moist, it gets covered by leaves and stuff like that. When I was in Wyoming, you could walk and find bones everywhere, antlers from several years ago, from deer and elk and stuff. I don't find much in the woods here. They just break down really quickly. And bears that die as well, little cubs. In the past few years, we've gotten more and more reports from people finding dead ones in the spring and stuff like that. And this past year was just a really bad year.
Yeah.
We actually, we were getting reports, it seems like, from people having these starving yearling bears that should have been 30 or 40 pounds that weighed 9 and 10 pounds. That would show up in someone's backyard or beside a road. We were getting those all winter. We were able to capture 17 of those and take them over to Ben Killen. For him to just keep until springtime, fatten up, they triple their weight, they're ready to go out and be on their own. They're wild bears. They're a year old that they made it on their own. It was such a bad year.
Where did you take them?
To Ben Killen, he's a rehabilitator for bears, and he does such a good job that we've got an agreement with New Hampshire that we can actually take bears over to them, but we have to bring them back when they're ready to go. So, yeah.
Dale, somebody said that you relocated the Middlebury babies? That's not true, is it?
That's not true.
No, okay, thanks.
There was a baby found on the mountain that you brought to them, but that's a whole different
But that's not,
situation.
I think of her as my bear because I live in about 1/2 acres. So my bear, you didn't take her babies away.
Do bears eat acorns as often as they eat beechnuts, or why are beech trees so important to a bear compared to oak?
Oak are very important for wildlife, including bears as well. Fortunately, we don't have oak all around the state at higher elevations like we do. We have beech trees everywhere. Unfortunately, the oak species we've got in the state that's the most common is the red oak, and it's a very bitter nut.
Okay.
Wildlife eat it because they have to.
Yeah.
But they don't like it as much as, if there are beech nuts available, they'll go to those before they'll go to the.
Yeah, white oak is sweeter, and so they might eat those.
Yeah, I wish
So
we had more white oak in the state.
We have a lot of acorns this year.
Yes.
Yeah.
At lower elevations, we're finding that the higher elevation oak didn't come through as much, but lower elevation is the best I've ever seen.
Right.
There's good oak trees on Snake Mountain, I was just out there the other day, it's good pine of oak there.
Yeah. You know, what'll be interesting if we had a mild winter, then the rodents eat all these nuts and stuff as well. And if we have a mild winter, they'll keep reproducing and eating all these nuts that are available. Kind of like the situation we had with gray squirrels
Yeah.
leading into last year. Remember, huge numbers of gray squirrels.
Yep.
Suddenly there were no nuts and their whole social structure broke down. They couldn't stay in their home ranges and stuff, had to travel like lemmings. And in a lot of those areas where we were seeing, on my way to work, I'd see 100 dead squirrels in the 20 miles driving.
Wow.
This year, I'll go a week without seeing a dead squirrel on the
Wow.
road.
Yeah,
It
noticed
just,
that.
that's the difference. And I go into the woods, there's lots of nuts, but I'm not hearing much for chipmunks and squirrels yet. Their population doesn't grow up to it. But they do cycle in, and every year is different.
Snake Mountain, is there more than one bear over there? I've heard there's one on the west side of Snake Mountain. I live on the east side and I haven't seen anything, and I walk up there and I horseback ride up there, and I hadn't seen any sign, but I hear there is one out there.
We've had more bear sightings this last 2 years in the valley than ever before in places we live in. Snake Mountain is unique because it's that one in the middle of all the farmland that's forested. I don't know, if you had one alpha male bear though, he's not going to really let too many other young ones unless it's a female, right?
Yeah, a big male will travel so much though. It's not as big as issue. The females are actually more territorial than the males are. If they've got a good food source, they don't want other bears to be using it unless they're related to them. It's actually pretty complicated on how they work with that. But I think what we're seeing in this area, like Middlebury here and stuff, is 20 years ago you probably didn't have many bears here, right? And so they're still kind of filtering down and getting established and developing home ranges here and trying to learn to live around people. And so for a period of years, it's going to be a transition with the numbers of bears and people learning to live with the bears and stuff. And that's what you're going through right now. I hope that in 10 years' time, people are like, it's a bear, no big deal, I know what to do. Electric fencing, secure my garbage, not have the bird feed around. So that's my dream, that people will change their behavior and we'll be able to live with bears better. They're a beautiful animal. What a thrill to see one every time, right? You encounter bears, it's wonderful. Even to encounter bear tracks in the woods and stuff, I just get a thrill out of that. It's a fascinating animal. One more question?
I have a
Yes?
skunk cabbage question. Just what did you try? Like, did you try enough so that you're pretty confident we can't get skunk cabbage to naturalize in our swamps?
No, I just had a sister who lived in Connecticut, had a swamp next door, and I grabbed a bunch and planted them in
So it's just one,
one area.
oh good. So there's really some room for experiment.
You know,
in
like
terms of-
Salisbury, I know, they've got some swamps that they've got a fair amount of skunk cabbage. And just in the past 10, 15 years, they're starting to have bears move in more.
That's
I
good
think
to
I've
know.
seen the skunk cabbage up on the Robert Frost Trail too.
It could be. There's one other plant that comes out real early in the spring. And I've had even foresters tell me that that's skunk cabbage. It's called false hellebore.
Oh, yeah.
And it's poisonous, and they don't eat that one. But a lot of people think that's skunk cabbage as well. But one looks like a cabbage with the big leaves and it's central, and the other one's more of a stalk.
Yeah.
The skunk cabbage is a broader leaf.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very
still
fleshy
grow-
leaves.
grows
and
up
stuff.
more.
Yeah.
Right, it's interesting, right?
Well, thanks
Well,
folks
thank
for
you.
coming.
Thank you.